What if the person you trusted most, the one who promised loyalty and friendship, secretly had plans to destroy the foundation of your life? Imagine waking up one morning, believing in love, respect, and trust, only to discover that the bonds you held dear were nothing more than illusions. This is exactly what Jessica Mulroney, the Canadian stylist, faced. And the story she's about to tell is more shocking, more heartbreaking, and more scandalous than anyone could have imagined. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, the woman whose public image exudes poise, diplomacy, and charm, is alleged to have crossed the ultimate line. She allegedly slept with Jessica's husband 23 times. 23. That number alone is enough to make the stomach churn, but the full scope of the betrayal is far more complex, twisted, and shocking than a single statistic could ever convey. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all started innocuously enough. Friends laughing together at a public event, shared social media posts, exchanged compliments, and a facade of closeness that appeared flawless to the outside world. But as Jessica would later discover, appearances can be devastatingly deceiving. When someone has the ability to charm millions, when charisma becomes a shield for deception, it becomes almost impossible to see the cracks forming until the collapse is inevitable. And collapse it did. What began as subtle manipulations, missed phone calls, oddly timed messages, ambiguous interactions, soon escalated into something far more sinister. The woman she had considered a friend, a confidant, someone who seemed to understand the pressures of life in the public eye, had allegedly been plotting a betrayal that no one could have foreseen. But why now? Why come forward with this explosive story after so much time? Timing, as Jessica explains, is everything. Some truths demand the light, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter the personal or public consequences. And in the age of social media, when whispers become headlines overnight, when private conversations are dissected and replayed for millions, silence can feel like complicity. Jessica's decision to speak out is not just about seeking justice. It's about reclaiming control of her narrative, protecting her family, and exposing a deception that shook the very core of her life. Yet, even as she steps into this storm, the story she unveils does not simply shock. It challenges everything we thought we knew about loyalty, friendship, and the complex web of relationships at the center of this saga. From the beginning, the stakes were incredibly high. Jessica's life was not just any life. It was one lived under public scrutiny, one where appearances mattered, where reputation was everything. Yet, even within the glare of public attention, some actions remain unseen. It's a cruel irony that the very qualities that make someone admired, their grace, their confidence, their social savvy, can also be wielded to conceal betrayal. And Meghan Markle, a woman celebrated worldwide, is alleged to have harnessed those exact qualities in a way that shattered Jessica's world. Imagine the emotional paradox. A public figure lauded for authenticity, allegedly capable of deception at the most intimate level. The cognitive dissonance alone is enough to leave anyone questioning reality. How could someone who smiled so warmly, who appeared so genuine, engage in actions that were fundamentally so destructive? This question gnaws at the heart of the story, compelling the audience to follow each revelation, each twist, with bated breath. Yet, it wasn't just the alleged affair itself that caused turmoil. The ripple effects, the subtle manipulations, the psychological games, and the erosion of trust created a landscape of emotional devastation. Jessica describes moments of doubt, nights spent awake wondering if she had missed signs, and days consumed by the gnawing suspicion that her instincts were right all along. Every text, every fleeting glance, every unexplained absence became a puzzle piece that eventually revealed a disturbing picture. And when the truth began to emerge, the shock was compounded by disbelief. How could this happen? How could someone so close, someone deemed a friend, engage in a deliberate act of betrayal against someone who had only ever shown support, loyalty, and friendship? The public persona of Meghan Markle adds another layer of complexity to this saga. For many, Meghan represents elegance, intellect, and a dedication to charitable causes. Her image is meticulously curated, every gesture calculated for public perception. Yet, behind the public smile, allegations suggest a darker, hidden side. one where personal desires allegedly eclipsed ethical boundaries, one where manipulation could coexist with charm, one where betrayal could unfold under the guise of friendship. The contrast between public image and private behavior forms the emotional core of Jessica's story. It's a narrative of dissonance, tension, and moral conflict, inviting the audience to grapple with the unsettling idea that the people we admire most may not always align with the values we attribute to them. And it isn't just about infidelity or scandal. At the heart of this story is the concept of trust, a fragile, vital thread that holds relationships together. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to repair, especially when the betrayal is compounded by public scrutiny and personal humiliation. Jessica's journey is a testament to the fragility of trust and the resilience required to navigate its shattering. Every revelation, every painful memory, every confrontation with the alleged reality of her husband's involvement underscores the high emotional stakes. The audience is drawn not merely to the sensational aspects of the story, but to the human experience within it. The fear, the heartbreak, the courage to confront a reality that seems almost too cruel to be true. Even as this narrative unfolds, questions loom larger than answers. What drove Meghan to allegedly pursue such a betrayal? How did Jessica's husband become entangled in a web of deception that seemed impossible to escape? Could anyone have prevented it? Or was this a carefully orchestrated pattern of manipulation from the beginning? Each question generates suspense, creating a tension that grips the audience and refuses to let go. As viewers, we are invited into the intimate and often painful spaces of Jessica's life, experiencing the shock, disbelief, and ultimately, the empowerment that comes from facing such an ordeal head-on. And yet, even as the details are revealed, the story is far from complete. The twists, the confrontations, and the consequences remain to be explored in depth. The introduction of this narrative also serves to frame the broader implications beyond the personal sphere. This is a story about human nature, about ambition, about envy, about the lengths people will go to achieve their desires, even at the expense of others. Jessica's revelations force us to examine not just the individuals involved, but the societal context in which these actions occurred. The celebrity culture, the media scrutiny, and the public fascination with scandal. How do public figures navigate personal morality in a world where every action is amplified, dissected, and judged? How does fame influence behavior? And to what extent can it mask or enable betrayal? These are the questions that linger as the narrative moves forward, inviting the audience to think critically and emotionally about the events that unfold. By now, the stage has been set. The characters are introduced, the stakes are clear, and the tension is palpable. We have glimpsed the emotional landscape of Jessica Mulroney's life, the alleged actions of Meghan Markle, and the devastating impact of the betrayal. Yet, the most shocking revelations are still ahead. The audience has been primed to experience disbelief, anger, sadness, and ultimately, curiosity that drives them to continue. And as we transition into the main content, the narrative promise remains. Each chapter will peel back another layer, exposing deeper truths, more startling facts, and the complex interplay of emotions, motives, and consequences that define this extraordinary story. The introduction concludes not with resolution, but with anticipation. It leaves the audience suspended on the edge of understanding, eager to uncover the full extent of the alleged affair, the hidden interactions, and the psychological and emotional fallout. The cliffhanger is simple yet powerful. What Jessica is about to reveal will shake not only her personal world, but the public's perception of those involved. And as we move forward, every chapter will escalate the stakes, deepen the intrigue, and draw the audience further into a narrative that is as dramatic, provocative, and emotionally charged as it is compelling. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. They laughed together in public, posed for pictures at glamorous events, and exchanged compliments on social media. On the surface, their friendship seemed enviable, unshakable, and perfectly curated. Jessica Mulroney and Meghan Markle appeared to be more than just acquaintances. They were friends, confidants, allies navigating the pressures of public life. But what looks flawless from the outside can be dangerously deceptive. Beneath the smiles, behind the sparkling gowns and camera flashes, a subtle tension was already brewing. Small actions, seemingly insignificant at first, slowly revealed cracks in a friendship that would eventually crumble under the weight of betrayal. The beginning of their relationship was almost cinematic. Two women, both navigating high-profile careers, finding solace in shared experiences. Jessica, already established in the world of fashion and television, understood the unique pressures of living life in the spotlight. Meghan, an actress with aspirations that extended far beyond Hollywood, seemed like a perfect fit for friendship, someone who got it. Their meetings were casual at first, lunch dates, coffee runs, shared tips on style, and public appearances. Each interaction built the perception of closeness, trust, and mutual admiration. And for Jessica, it felt good to have someone in her corner, someone who seemed genuinely supportive. But friendship is a two-edged sword when envy and ambition enter the mix. The subtle warning signs started quietly. Missed calls that weren't returned, comments that seemed offhand but carried an undercurrent of judgment, invitations that suddenly never materialized. At first, Jessica brushed these moments off. After all, Meghan's life was becoming increasingly complex. Hollywood schedules, charitable work, and eventually, a transition into royalty. But these small incidents, repeated over time, began to form a pattern. Patterns are dangerous because they start innocently, almost imperceptibly. The first time you notice it, it seems like coincidence. The 10th time, it becomes undeniable. And Jessica began noticing. Social media interactions were particularly revealing. At first, they were warm, playful, and supportive. Photos of events together, public praises for each other's work, and friendly comments all suggested a solid bond. But as time went on, there were moments of subtle undermining. A post that seemed offhand, a caption that carried an unexpected sting, or a compliment that felt more like a comparison than genuine praise. Jessica began to feel the shift, but struggled to articulate it. How do you confront someone who seems flawless in public, whose every action is polished and intentional? How do you challenge someone whose very image is admired by millions, when your own perception begins to feel like paranoia? These questions gnawed at her, creating anxiety that she could not easily dispel. The turning point in the friendship, Jessica would later reflect, came during an event that should have been purely celebratory. Both women were invited to a high-profile gala, a space where elegance, poise, and appearances mattered above all else. What began as a night of laughter and camaraderie ended with subtle slights, whispered remarks, and body language that betrayed unspoken tension. Jessica recalls feeling a mix of confusion and unease, a sensation that something in their dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The same person who had once seemed like a supportive friend now exuded a different energy, competitiveness, subtle condescension, and a silent assertion of control. It's a strange and painful realization when someone you trust begins to reveal themselves in ways you never expected. And then came the small but insidious acts that foreshadowed the alleged betrayal. Invitations to private events would be delayed, only to discover Meghan was attending with someone else. Advice given in private meetings would later be contradicted publicly, undermining Jessica's professional reputation in ways that seemed almost deliberate. It's the type of behavior that, in isolation, could be dismissed as coincidence or miscommunication. But when patterns emerge, when multiple small actions align to create a narrative, it becomes impossible to ignore. The friendship, once a source of comfort, began to feel like a minefield, where every step was fraught with the potential for deception, misunderstanding, or hidden motives. Jessica's intuition, honed by years of navigating the public eye, began to signal danger. She noticed the subtle shifts in tone, the pauses before responses, and the careful wording that hinted at an agenda. The emotional tension was compounded by the fact that Meghan's public persona remained impeccable. Outwardly, she was the same charming, poised, and admired figure. But the contrast between public image and private behavior created cognitive dissonance, leaving Jessica questioning her own perceptions. Was she imagining the slights? Was her mind reading too much into innocent actions? It's a question familiar to anyone who experiences betrayal. How do you reconcile reality when it conflicts so drastically with appearances? It was during this period of subtle unease that Jessica first noticed interactions with her husband that didn't feel entirely appropriate. In retrospect, small moments that seemed innocent at the time, private conversations, unexpected favors, shared jokes, took on new significance. Jessica began to feel an unfamiliar tension, a creeping suspicion that something more than friendship might be occurring. She struggled to articulate this feeling, caught between doubt and instinct. Yet, as the story would later reveal, these early observations were just the beginning, a prelude to a series of events that would escalate into what she describes as one of the most devastating betrayals of her life. Friends and family began to notice the change in Jessica as well. Her demeanor shifted subtly, moments of distraction, emotional distance, and moments of quiet reflection that hinted at internal conflict. It is often said that betrayal begins long before the act itself, and in Jessica's case, the emotional erosion started well before any public revelation. The psychological impact of sensing duplicity, feeling manipulated, and questioning loyalty is profound. It's a tension that builds quietly, gnawing at confidence and peace of mind, creating a slow burn of anxiety and anticipation. And in this narrative, that slow burn would soon ignite into full-blown emotional and social chaos. Despite the mounting tension, Jessica attempted to salvage the friendship. She reached out, tried to clarify intentions, and even defended Meghan in public conversations. But the responses, measured, polished, and sometimes dismissive, only reinforced the sense that the dynamic was shifting. The imbalance in their friendship became increasingly apparent. One person exerting influence and control, the other caught between loyalty and suspicion. The complexity of the relationship, compounded by public scrutiny and professional stakes, created an environment ripe for misunderstanding, but also ripe for deliberate manipulation. It is a dynamic familiar to anyone who has faced betrayal from someone close. The person who seems closest can also become the most dangerous. And as these patterns unfolded, Jessica began to piece together what would eventually become the central narrative of her story. Small actions, seemingly insignificant in isolation, coalesced into a clear pattern of behavior. The subtle undermining, the calculated omissions, and the carefully crafted public persona all pointed toward a deeper betrayal. One that involved not just friendship but intimacy, trust, and personal boundaries. The emotional stakes were higher than ever. Jessica realized that this was no longer about minor slights or professional jealousy. It was about the fundamental integrity of her personal life and the people she trusted most. The realization was crushing, and yet, she had little recourse but to observe, analyze, and prepare for the confrontation that she knew was inevitable. By the end of this chapter, the audience begins to understand the fragile line between friendship and betrayal. The initial charm, the laughter, and the apparent camaraderie were all part of a dynamic that would later reveal itself to be fraught with danger. The friendship, once a source of joy and support, became a lens through which the audience can examine the early signs of manipulation and the emotional complexity of trust. We see how subtle actions can escalate, how public image can mask private intentions, and how intuition often senses truths before the mind fully understands them. But just as Jessica was beginning to grasp the depth of the tension, the first concrete signs of betrayal appeared. Texts, meetings, and interactions that initially seemed harmless began to take on a new, sinister significance. The audience is left with a growing sense of dread and anticipation. What starts as subtle tension will soon erupt into shocking revelations that none of the participants could have predicted. The friendship that once seemed invincible is teetering on the edge of destruction, and what comes next will change everything. It began with a message, a simple text, almost innocuous in its wording, but it carried a weight that Jessica would come to recognize as the first true signal of betrayal. The kind of message that makes you pause, reread, and question your instincts. At first, she tried to dismiss it, attributing it to coincidence or miscommunication. But deep down, a spark of unease ignited, one she couldn't ignore. There is a distinct moment in every story of betrayal when intuition whispers louder than reason, when your gut tells you something is off, even if every outward appearance suggests otherwise. For Jessica, that moment was this message, an event that would mark the start of a revelation so devastating it would alter the course of her life. The text seemed harmless on the surface, casual, friendly, almost playful. But Jessica sensed a subtle undertone, a familiarity in the phrasing that did not sit right. It was as though boundaries had been crossed in a space she had assumed was private, safe, and respectful. And in the world of relationships, whether professional, platonic, or romantic, boundaries are everything. When those lines are crossed, even in small ways, they can signal something far larger lurking beneath the surface. It's that first crack in the dam, the moment when small acts begin to compound, creating a tidal wave of emotional and practical consequences that no one is prepared for. As days went by, Jessica began noticing patterns in Meghan's interactions with her husband. These weren't just ordinary social interactions. They were carefully orchestrated exchanges that revealed an intimacy that should have remained off-limits. Texts sent at odd hours, seemingly casual conversations that were unusually detailed, and small gestures that were later replayed in her mind with a sense of mounting dread. At first, Jessica questioned herself. Was she overreacting? Was this normal social friendliness, blown out of proportion by her own insecurities? It's a question many face when betrayal begins quietly. How do you distinguish between innocent behavior and deliberate manipulation? The answer is often revealed not in a single incident, but in the accumulation of evidence over time. Then came the first physical signs that hinted at a deeper breach. Unexpected meetings, unexplained absences, and coincidences that became too frequent to ignore. Jessica noticed subtle changes in her husband's behavior, distracted glances, hesitation in responses, and a defensiveness that had never existed before. The combination of these factors, the texts, the odd interactions, the shifts in behavior, created a mounting tension that Jessica could no longer ignore. Betrayal rarely arrives fully formed. It creeps in, disguised as friendship, charm, or coincidence, until the damage is done. And Jessica's intuition, honed over years of managing both public and private pressures, was telling her that something serious was happening. Friends and colleagues began to notice too. The subtle changes in her demeanor, the moments of introspection, and the occasional withdrawal were signs of an internal struggle she could not yet articulate. Betrayal does not exist in isolation. It impacts everyone around you. Observers can sometimes sense the tension before the person experiencing it fully acknowledges the reality. Jessica's social circle, attuned to her normally vibrant personality, began to sense a shift, a quiet warning that all was not as it seemed. The tension was almost palpable, a background hum that underscored every interaction, every conversation, and every decision. The psychological toll was immense. Jessica found herself questioning her judgment, replaying interactions in her mind, analyzing every gesture and word for hidden meaning. This type of emotional labor, trying to decipher intent, motive, and truth, is exhausting, draining, and isolating. It's one of the most insidious aspects of betrayal. It forces the victim into a state of hyper-awareness, constantly monitoring, questioning, and second-guessing. Jessica describes sleepless nights spent pondering what could be happening behind her back, haunted by scenarios that seemed almost too fantastical to believe, yet too consistent to dismiss. Amid this growing unease, one particularly telling incident occurred. Jessica had arranged a professional meeting for her husband, fully expecting it to be attended by colleagues and associates she trusted. But Meghan unexpectedly appeared. On the surface, it seemed like a benign, coincidental interaction. Two acquaintances meeting in a professional setting. Yet the nature of Meghan's behavior, her focused attention, her subtle body language, and the intensity of her interest in her husband's responses suggested something far more intimate than a professional curiosity. It was a moment that lingered in Jessica's mind, replayed repeatedly with growing apprehension. Why was Meghan so intent on his attention? Why did the interaction feel charged with unspoken subtext? The answers were not yet clear, but the unease was undeniable. Shortly after this incident, Jessica began to notice patterns of exclusion. Invitations to social gatherings, collaborative projects, and even casual outings that had once included her were suddenly missing or redirected. It was as though a wedge was being driven into her social and personal life, subtly isolating her while simultaneously positioning Meghan as an influential presence. This is a classic tactic in manipulation. The slow erosion of trust, the gradual assertion of influence, and the creation of dependency or attention toward a new person while distancing the original support network. Jessica's awareness of these dynamics, while acute, could not prevent the subtle psychological impact. She felt a growing sense of displacement, questioning her role and relevance in both her personal and professional spheres. The emotional tension was compounded by public perception. Meghan's carefully curated image continued to shine, charming, composed, and admired by millions. This stark contrast between public persona and private behavior created a cognitive dissonance that left Jessica, and anyone observing closely, questioning reality. How could someone who appeared so perfect, so polished, engage in acts that were fundamentally so destructive? This dissonance is at the heart of many high-profile betrayals. The more immaculate the public image, the more shocking the private transgressions. The audience, reading this story, begins to feel that tension as well, caught between admiration for Meghan's public achievements and disbelief at the alleged private actions. Then came the early confrontations, small, tentative, and emotionally charged. Jessica, sensing the mounting risk, began to probe gently, asking questions, observing reactions, and testing boundaries. The responses she received were measured, polished, and carefully constructed, neither confirming nor denying the suspicions that had begun to take root. This is a hallmark of manipulation, creating uncertainty while maintaining plausible deniability. Every interaction became a puzzle, every response a potential clue, and every pause in conversation a source of anxiety. Jessica describes these moments as emotionally exhausting, like walking a tightrope suspended over a chasm she could see but could not yet quantify. It was during this period that small, seemingly unrelated pieces of information began to coalesce into a disturbing picture. Reports from mutual acquaintances, snippets of conversation, and the pattern of interactions with her husband began to reveal a deeper level of connection than previously imagined. Each revelation was incremental, building a sense of dread and urgency. Jessica began documenting interactions, mentally cataloging incidents, and trying to make sense of a reality that seemed increasingly surreal. Betrayal, she realized, does not announce itself with fanfare. It arrives in fragments, each piece contributing to a larger, more disturbing narrative that only becomes clear in retrospect. By the end of this chapter, the audience can see the precise moment when friendship began its transformation into betrayal. The text messages, the subtle manipulations, the exclusion, and the shifting behaviors were all harbingers of a deeper transgression yet to be fully revealed. The tension has been established, the emotional stakes are clear, and the anticipation of revelation is heightened. Jessica's journey through suspicion, observation, and emotional turmoil sets the stage for the next phase of the story, the undeniable evidence, the confrontations, and the revelations that will shock not only her, but the world. And as the audience waits, a cliffhanger looms. The subtle signs have been identified, the tension is palpable, and the first undeniable act of betrayal is about to surface, an act that will irrevocably alter the dynamics of friendship, marriage, and trust. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The number was staggering. 23. 23 secret encounters between Meghan Markle and Jessica Mulroney's husband. At first, it seemed impossible to believe, an exagger born of fear or heartbreak. But as the evidence emerged, as messages, timelines, and corroborating accounts came together, the horrifying reality crystallized. These were not fleeting mistakes or innocent lapses. This was a sustained, calculated series of interactions, meticulously hidden under the veneer of normalcy, deception, and public civility. The revelation hit Jessica like a freight train, a tidal wave of disbelief, rage, and sorrow crashing over every aspect of her life. The first encounters were almost imperceptible. Casual lunches, coincidental meetings at events, shared rides, moments that, in isolation, seemed perfectly ordinary. Jessica didn't initially suspect anything because, on the surface, these interactions could be explained away as professional courtesy, friendship, or happenstance. But the pattern was undeniable when placed together. The frequency, the timing, and the secrecy all pointed to something far more intimate and intentional. 23 encounters. It's not a number one forgets. It is an imprint, a mark of repeated decisions, deliberate choices, and conscious actions that betray trust at the deepest level. The logistics alone were staggering. To engage in this level of clandestine interaction required coordination, planning, and, crucially, a disregard for the potential consequences. Jessica began piecing together the timeline, noting the days, times, and circumstances surrounding each encounter. Some occurred during times she was away, others in places that seemed innocuous to the outside eye, but carried a hidden intimacy that only those involved would recognize. Every detail added weight to the mounting realization that this was not a series of chance occurrences. It was intentional. As the encounters became clearer, the emotional impact intensified. Jessica recalls the wave of disbelief when she began to recognize that her instincts had been right all along. The betrayal was not a momentary lapse. It was sustained, deliberate, and repeated. 23 times. Each encounter chipped away at the trust she had placed in her husband, in Meghan, and in the friendship she had once believed unshakable. The human mind struggles with the scale of repeated betrayal, particularly when it comes from multiple trusted sources. It's one thing to be hurt by a single act. It's another to realize that the act has been repeated, normalized, and concealed over time. The secrecy surrounding these encounters was deliberate and meticulous. Meetings were carefully orchestrated to avoid detection. Communication was coded or hidden, and any potential witnesses were kept at arm's length. It's a level of deception that is both impressive and terrifying, a testament to the lengths people will go to when desire, ambition, or compulsion override morality. Jessica discovered that each encounter was not only physical, but often emotionally manipulative, designed to create intimacy, trust, and connection in ways that undermined her marriage without drawing public scrutiny. The psychological weight of such a betrayal is profound, as it forces the victim to grapple with both the reality of the infidelity and the sophisticated manner in which it was executed. What made the situation even more shocking was the audacity of the encounters. Some took place in highly publicized locations, where the risk of discovery was considerable, suggesting a confidence or recklessness that compounded the betrayal. Others were arranged in private spaces, deliberately isolated to ensure secrecy. The contrast between the public personas maintained by those involved and the private actions they engaged in creates a tension that is almost cinematic in its drama. On one hand, the world sees charm, grace, and friendship. On the other, the hidden narrative is one of deception, secrecy, and repeated transgression. This duality is at the heart of the emotional impact for Jessica, who had to reconcile her perception of reality with the unfolding truth. The first undeniable proof came in the form of messages, texts, emails, and call logs that could not be dismissed or explained away. Each message carried its own weight, hinting at meetings, shared moments, and emotional intimacy. The tone ranged from casual to flirtatious, with undertones that suggested familiarity beyond what would be appropriate for friends or acquaintances. Jessica remembers reading these messages and feeling a combination of shock, anger, and heartbreak. The words on the screen were a betrayal of trust, a confirmation of suspicions she had harbored but had hoped were unfounded. The proof was no longer circumstantial. It was tangible, irrefutable, and devastating. The psychological impact of discovering repeated betrayal cannot be overstated. Jessica describes a sense of disorientation, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Familiar routines, shared moments, and personal history were all recontextualized in light of the new information. The world she thought she knew, the home, the marriage, the friendship, suddenly seemed fragile, unstable, and unrecognizable. 23 encounters are not just numbers. They represent choices, repeated decisions to violate trust, and a pattern of behavior that fundamentally altered the dynamics of her relationships. The emotional weight of processing such information is immense, encompassing grief, anger, confusion, and a profound sense of loss. Even as the reality of these encounters sank in, Jessica faced another layer of complexity. the public image of Meghan Markle. For many, Meghan is a figure of poise, charm, and principled public engagement. Reconciling the public persona with the private actions revealed by these encounters was a mental exercise in cognitive dissonance. How could someone who appeared so committed to dignity, fairness, and respect engage in repeated, secretive acts of betrayal? The juxtaposition of public image and private behavior intensified the shock, adding a dimension of incredulity that compounded the emotional impact. For Jessica, it wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the realization that deception had been meticulously concealed behind a mask of charm, grace, and celebrity. As the evidence mounted, so did the need for action. Jessica knew she could not remain passive, yet confronting the situation carried enormous personal and social risks. Any disclosure, confrontation, or attempt to address the betrayal could ripple through her social circle, professional networks, and even the broader public. This is the dilemma that victims of high-profile betrayal often face: the tension between protecting oneself and exposing wrongdoing, between private grief and public revelation. The stakes were extraordinarily high, both emotionally and practically, and every decision carried consequences that could reverberate for years. The chapter closes on a note of anticipation and dread. The secret encounters, while now partially documented and confirmed, represent only a fraction of the full story. The emotional devastation they wrought is only beginning to be understood, and the consequences, personal, relational, and public, loom large. Jessica's journey through discovery, shock, and emotional turmoil sets the stage for the next phase of the narrative, confronting the truth, revealing the hidden interactions in greater detail, and navigating the fallout from a betrayal that is as profound as it is scandalous. And just as Jessica began to absorb the full weight of what had occurred, a new revelation emerged, one that would complicate the situation further, escalate the stakes, and deepen the emotional impact. The encounters, it seemed, were only the beginning, and what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Jessica Mulroney had always considered herself a woman of resilience, someone capable of navigating the challenges of life under public scrutiny. She understood the pressures of fame, the glare of social attention, and the delicate balance required to maintain both personal and professional relationships in a high-profile environment. But nothing could have prepared her for the emotional devastation that followed the revelation of Meghan Markle's alleged encounters with her husband. 23 secret meetings, each one a calculated breach of trust, were not just numbers on a list. They were a relentless series of blows to her heart, mind, and sense of reality. The initial shock was paralyzing. Jessica describes it as a moment when the world seemed to stop, a sensation in which every thought, every emotion, and every memory was suddenly filtered through the lens of betrayal. How could the people she trusted most, the friends she admired, the husband she loved, engage in something so deliberate, so hurtful, and so destructive? The mind struggles to process betrayal on this scale. Rational thought collides with emotion, memory is reinterpreted, and every interaction is scrutinized for hidden meaning. In those first days, Jessica found herself reliving moments she had once dismissed, now reframed as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized existed. Anger came in waves, often unpredictable and overwhelming. There were moments when she could barely speak, consumed by the intensity of rage at the duplicity and audacity of the alleged actions. How could someone act so brazenly, hiding repeated encounters under layers of charm, social grace, and plausibly deniable behavior? The anger was not directed solely at Meghan. It was also aimed at her husband, whose choices, according to Jessica, violated the very foundation of their relationship. Betrayal carries multiple dimensions, and in this case, it encompassed both emotional and moral violations, leaving Jessica grappling with a profound sense of injustice and disbelief. But alongside anger was grief. Grief for the friendship that had once seemed unbreakable, grief for the marriage she had believed to be secure, and grief for the personal sense of safety and trust that had been shattered. Emotional betrayal often evokes a complex mix of feelings, blending sadness with incredulity, loss with humiliation, and heartbreak with disbelief. Jessica recounts days filled with tears, sleepless nights, and a constant mental replay of events that left her exhausted and emotionally drained. Grief in such circumstances is not linear. It ebbs and flows unpredictably, surfacing in moments of quiet reflection, in the midst of public appearances, or triggered by a seemingly innocuous reminder. The betrayal also created a profound sense of isolation. Jessica found herself questioning whom she could trust, unsure of how much of her social circle had been aware or complicit in the unfolding events. Isolation is a common consequence of high-profile betrayal, amplified by the need to maintain appearances while processing intense emotional trauma. For Jessica, the dichotomy between her public persona and private anguish created an additional layer of tension. Outwardly, she had to project composure and professionalism. Inwardly, she was navigating a storm of heartbreak, anger, and uncertainty. This dissonance intensified the emotional weight of the experience, forcing her to compartmentalize feelings that could not safely be expressed in public. Anxiety became a constant companion. Jessica describes a pervasive sense of hypervigilance, a state in which every message, interaction, and glance was scrutinized for hidden meaning. This anxiety was not merely situational. It penetrated the very fabric of her daily life. Routine activities became fraught with tension. Answering calls, checking messages, interacting with friends, or even attending events felt laden with the potential for further betrayal or exposure. It is a common psychological consequence of repeated emotional betrayal, one that underscores the profound disruption such experiences create in a person's sense of safety and control. Humiliation compounded the emotional fallout. Jessica understood that her situation, once publicized, would attract scrutiny, judgment, and speculation. The knowledge that others would analyze, debate, and dissect the intimate betrayal she experienced added a layer of social anxiety to an already intense personal crisis. The humiliation was not merely about the actions themselves, but about the perceived failure to see them coming, the exposure of vulnerability, and the public interpretation of events. This is one of the cruel ironies of betrayal. The victim often bears a disproportionate burden of emotional labor, self-questioning, and social consequence. As the emotional shockwaves continued, Jessica began to navigate a complex web of decisions. How should she confront her husband? Should she confront Meghan? Should she go public or remain private? Each choice carried enormous consequences, both personal and professional. Confrontation could lead to resolution or escalation. Disclosure could bring justice or further scrutiny. Silence could maintain appearances but perpetuate internal anguish. The decision-making process itself became an additional source of stress, requiring careful consideration of emotional, social, and practical factors. In high-stakes betrayal, the victim is forced to weigh every action with extraordinary precision, knowing that missteps could exacerbate the already profound fallout. Support systems became crucial. Friends and family provided emotional grounding, offering perspectives that helped Jessica navigate the tumultuous terrain of betrayal. Yet even here, complexities emerged. Trust had been shaken to the core. Jessica found herself questioning whether anyone outside her immediate family truly understood the depth of the deception. Support, while invaluable, could not fully mitigate the psychological impact of repeated infidelity and manipulation. It is in this context that Jessica began documenting interactions, preserving evidence, and preparing herself emotionally for the confrontations that she sensed were inevitable. In parallel, professional life continued, demanding composure and performance even as her personal world unraveled. Jessica describes the challenge of maintaining a public persona, appearing poised on camera, and engaging with colleagues while carrying the burden of betrayal. The tension between private grief and public performance added another layer of complexity to the emotional fallout. It is a reminder that in the lives of high-profile individuals, personal crises are rarely confined to private spaces. They interact with public responsibilities in ways that amplify stress and emotional strain. One of the most insidious aspects of this fallout was the sense of betrayal by perception. Jessica had to reconcile the image she had of Meghan, the friend, the confidant, the admired public figure, with the reality of the alleged encounters. Cognitive dissonance, the psychological tension created when reality contradicts perception, intensified the emotional impact. How could someone so polished, so articulate, and seemingly principled engage in acts so fundamentally hurtful? Reconciling these contradictions became a central struggle, one that deepened the sense of shock, disbelief, and emotional disorientation. Amid grief, anger, and anxiety, Jessica began to plan her next steps. She sought clarity, preparation, and a way to regain control over her personal narrative. The emotional fallout, while devastating, also sparked resilience. She recognized that confronting betrayal required both courage and strategy. Emotional processing alone was insufficient. Action, reflection, and careful planning were necessary. This dual process of navigating raw emotion while preparing for decisive action is at the heart of her journey, highlighting the complexity of human response to profound betrayal. By the end of this chapter, the audience fully grasps the depth of the emotional impact. Betrayal is no longer abstract or theoretical. It is lived, experienced, and deeply felt. Jessica's grief, anger, anxiety, and humiliation form a tapestry of human emotion that resonates universally, even as the particulars of her story remain extraordinary. The stage is set for confrontation, for uncovering the full scope of secret actions, and for exploring the psychological and relational consequences of betrayal at this scale. And as Jessica began to process the initial shock, she realized that the fallout was only beginning. The consequences of 23 secret encounters, coupled with public perception, personal grief, and professional considerations, would ripple outward in ways she could not yet fully predict. The audience is left with a tense anticipation. The emotional devastation has been revealed, but what comes next, the confrontation, the undeniable evidence, the hidden truths, is about to escalate the drama even further. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In the world of celebrities and high-profile figures, image is everything. The way a person is perceived by the public can define careers, shape influence, and dictate social power. For Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, that image has been meticulously curated over years of public life, from her Hollywood career to royal appearances and philanthropic endeavors. To millions, she embodies elegance, intelligence, and principled behavior. Yet, beneath the carefully crafted public persona, Jessica Mulroney discovered an alleged private reality that contrasted sharply with what the world saw. This dichotomy, between the public image and the private actions, became one of the most emotionally jarring and psychologically complex aspects of the betrayal. Jessica had spent years navigating high-profile social circles herself. She understood the importance of image, the necessity of controlling narratives, and the fine line between privacy and public perception. But even her experience could not prepare her for the cognitive dissonance she felt when confronted with the contrast between Meghan's external persona and the alleged private behavior. Publicly, Meghan appeared poised, composed, and engaged in charitable work. Privately, according to Jessica, the interactions with her husband were calculated, secretive, and deeply intimate. This duality created a tension that was not only shocking but profoundly disorienting. How could the same person who smiled graciously at cameras, who gave heartfelt speeches, and who seemed committed to family and friendship, allegedly engage in repeated acts of betrayal? The contrast was stark in social settings. Public appearances were carefully staged. Friendly greetings, supportive gestures, and an image of cordiality that suggested loyalty and respect. Jessica recalls attending events with Meghan where everything appeared perfect on the surface. Laughter, conversation, and smiles for the cameras. But behind the scenes, the alleged reality was far different. Meetings with her husband had taken place in secrecy. Texts and messages suggested a level of intimacy and emotional connection that should have been impossible to reconcile with public behavior. The tension between these two worlds, the polished, controlled public image and the alleged clandestine private actions, created a sense of surreal disbelief for Jessica, leaving her struggling to reconcile reality with perception. This duality also amplified the emotional impact of the betrayal. When someone maintains a flawless public persona while allegedly engaging in private deception, it challenges the victim's understanding of trust, character, and judgment. Jessica found herself questioning everything she had believed. The authenticity of conversations, the intent behind gestures, and the sincerity of interactions. Every compliment, every friendly word, and every supportive action was reevaluated under the lens of suspicion. Cognitive dissonance is exhausting, particularly when the stakes are deeply personal. The mind struggles to reconcile two conflicting realities, the image presented to the world and the reality experienced in private interactions. Social media played a critical role in highlighting this contrast. Meghan's online presence was polished, curated, and consistent with her public image. Images of charity events, glamorous appearances, and supportive statements painted a picture of a woman committed to goodwill and propriety. Yet, when juxtaposed with the alleged private encounters, the contrast was jarring. Jessica recalls moments when scrolling through posts felt almost surreal, seeing Meghan's smiling face in public contexts while knowing, in private, about interactions that betrayed trust and intimacy. Social media, designed to project perfection, can deepen the emotional blow when the private reality is so starkly different. It serves as a constant reminder of what is hidden, reinforcing feelings of anger, disbelief, and betrayal. This tension extended beyond Jessica's immediate emotional response. It complicated her ability to communicate the situation to friends, family, and colleagues. When discussing the betrayal, she found herself having to navigate the gap between perception and reality. Publicly, Meghan was admired, praised, and protected by the media. Privately, she was alleged to have violated boundaries repeatedly. Explaining this contrast to others often felt like an uphill battle. Many people struggled to reconcile the public persona with the alleged private actions, sometimes doubting Jessica's account or attributing the situation to misunderstanding. This gap between public perception and private reality intensified her sense of isolation, leaving her to grapple with emotions that were invisible to outsiders, yet deeply impactful. One particularly harrowing aspect of this contrast was the public's reaction to interactions between Meghan and Jessica's family or social circle. Events that had once seemed ordinary, coffees, casual meetings, or shared outings, took on new meaning once the private betrayal was considered. The audience, in this case Jessica herself, was forced to view the interactions through a dual lens, one that acknowledged the public friendliness and one that recognized the hidden motives and intimacy allegedly occurring behind closed doors. This constant mental reevaluation of social interactions created a heightened sense of vigilance, anxiety, and mistrust, further compounding the emotional fallout. Moreover, the alleged private actions were not simply interpersonal. They carried implications for social and professional dynamics as well. The betrayal intersected with Jessica's professional life, her reputation, and her social standing. The secrecy and duplicity created a web of influence that affected decision-making, perceptions, and alliances. Those who were unaware of the private interactions saw only a friendly, collaborative relationship, while Jessica experienced the underlying betrayal in all its emotional and practical complexity. Navigating this dichotomy required careful observation, strategic thinking, and emotional fortitude, highlighting the extraordinary psychological burden placed on someone facing repeated and concealed deception. The contrast between image and reality also exposed a broader truth about human behavior, particularly among high-profile figures. Appearances are often curated to serve purpose, influence, and perception. The more admired a person is publicly, the more surprising and painful private transgressions can appear when revealed. Jessica reflects on the irony of this dynamic. The very traits that make someone publicly admirable, poise, charm, intelligence, charisma, can also be used to conceal acts of betrayal, making the revelation of such actions all the more devastating. The cognitive dissonance created by this contrast is not only emotionally taxing, but also psychologically destabilizing, as the mind attempts to reconcile two realities that seem mutually exclusive. As Jessica navigated this dual reality, she began to develop strategies for coping with the emotional strain. Documentation of interactions became essential, as did careful observation of behavior, timelines, and patterns. She learned to differentiate between what was public performance and what might indicate private intentions, attempting to reconstruct the truth behind the appearances. This process, while necessary, was emotionally exhausting, requiring a level of vigilance and analysis few are prepared to sustain. Yet, it was a critical step in regaining a sense of control in a situation that had seemed overwhelmingly chaotic. By the end of this chapter, the audience is fully aware of the profound tension created by the alleged private actions of Meghan Markle juxtaposed against her public image. Jessica's experience highlights the emotional and psychological complexity of betrayal in high-profile contexts, emphasizing how appearances can mask reality and amplify the impact of deception. The contrast between public perception and private behavior deepens the stakes, both emotionally and socially, setting the stage for the confrontations, revelations, and personal reckonings to come. And just as Jessica began to process the dissonance, the first direct confrontations loomed on the horizon. The tension between public image and private reality would soon collide with undeniable evidence, forcing truth into the open. The audience is left with a powerful cliffhanger. The polished public persona cannot hide private actions forever, and what comes next will shatter illusions, and no one saw it coming. The moment of confrontation is the fulcrum upon which betrayal pivots, where suspicion transforms into acknowledgement, where tension becomes action, and where emotion explodes into reality. For Jessica Mulroney, that moment was inevitable. After the first subtle signs, the patterns of secret encounters, and the emotional fallout, she could no longer ignore the truth. She knew that to survive, to reclaim control of her life, and to protect her family, she had to confront both her husband and the alleged betrayer, Meghan Markle. But confrontation is never simple, particularly when it involves people whose influence, charisma, and public standing are immense. Jessica recalls the night vividly. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation and dread. Every word she had rehearsed in her mind seemed insufficient to capture the gravity of the situation. Anger and grief vied for dominance, while rational thought fought to maintain composure. She knew that confrontation was not just a matter of accusation. It was a delicate dance of emotion, proof, and strategy. Every gesture, every word, and every pause carried immense weight, capable of influencing the trajectory of her relationships and the emotional stability of all involved. The confrontation began with her husband. She approached him not with blind rage, but with a precise, piercing intensity. Questions were direct, evidence presented clearly, and emotions carefully controlled. It is a common misconception that confronting betrayal is about immediate catharsis. In reality, effective confrontation requires planning, composure, and clarity. Jessica had spent countless hours documenting interactions, arranging timelines, and preparing for the inevitable denials and deflections she knew she might face. The preparation was crucial. It transformed raw emotion into actionable insight, allowing her to maintain agency in a situation designed to destabilize her. Her husband's initial reaction was defensive. There were denials, pauses, and attempts to deflect responsibility. But the evidence was undeniable. Texts, call logs, and observed patterns of behavior left little room for ambiguity. Jessica recalls the surreal experience of watching someone she loved navigate the consequences of their actions in real time. The mixture of shame, fear, and rationalization that played across his expressions. Confrontation is never just about the betrayer. It is about the interplay of emotions between both parties, the subtle shifts in power, and the mutual recognition of rupture. In this moment, Jessica realized that the betrayal was more than the acts themselves. It was the systematic deception that had been woven over months, creating a tapestry of lies that required careful unraveling. After addressing her husband, the focus shifted to Meghan Markle. This was the confrontation that carried the highest stakes. Emotionally, socially, and publicly, Meghan, with her polished public persona, charisma, and social influence, represented an opponent in a psychological sense. Jessica had to navigate the complex interplay of truth, perception, and power, aware that public scrutiny and personal consequence loomed over every word exchanged. The confrontation was not merely an accusation. It was an assertion of boundaries, an insistence on accountability, and a declaration of agency in the face of repeated deception. The exchange was emotionally charged. Jessica recalls moments of tension so thick they could be cut with a knife, glances that communicated unspoken truths, words that carried multiple layers of meaning, and silences that were almost louder than speech. Confrontation in cases of high-profile betrayal is rarely straightforward. It is layered, strategic, and emotionally exhausting. Every reaction must be interpreted, every defense anticipated, and every potential escalation accounted for. Jessica's preparation and acute observation allowed her to navigate this treacherous terrain, maintaining control while asserting the reality of the betrayal. What emerged from the confrontation was both shocking and clarifying. The evidence, once hidden beneath layers of secrecy, could no longer be denied. Patterns, timelines, and corroborating details painted a vivid picture of the alleged interactions. The 23 secret encounters, the hidden meetings, and the emotional manipulations. The confrontation transformed suspicion into acknowledgement, though the emotional impact remained profound. Jessica describes a mix of relief, anger, and disbelief, emotions that are often intertwined in moments of revealed truth. The confrontation does not erase betrayal. It simply forces recognition, catalyzing a process of reckoning that can lead to resolution, healing, or further turmoil. The psychological aftermath of confrontation is significant. Jessica had expected anger, perhaps shock or remorse, but the confrontation also revealed nuances she hadn't anticipated: rationalizations, partial admissions, and the human tendency to protect oneself even in the face of clear wrongdoing. This is a key aspect of betrayal dynamics. Those who have deceived often employ defense mechanisms, distortions, and selective truths to mitigate accountability. Jessica's ability to remain grounded, present evidence clearly, and assert her emotional and moral perspective was critical in navigating these complex interactions. Social dynamics further complicated the confrontation. Given Meghan's public standing, any interaction carried the risk of leakage, rumor, or misrepresentation. Jessica had to contend not only with the emotional intensity of personal betrayal, but also with the potential for public scrutiny, media coverage, and social fallout. This elevated the stakes significantly, requiring a careful balance between emotional expression, strategic communication, and protective boundaries. Confrontation in such circumstances is as much about managing perception as it is about seeking accountability, a delicate balance that Jessica navigated with determination and poise.